Welcome to the channel and welcome to the new series. Initially, this was going to actually be a new channel, but I figured it's relevant. Let's just keep it on here, even though we're still demonetized. And this probably won't help with monetization at all. Uh, just as a note, if you want to support the channel, I do make stuff. I mean, these two hats are for sale. This one's mine. And we also have a GoFundMe and we have a Patreon. So you want to support us since we're demonetized, please. Uh, I do take commissions. I think I said in one interview that I'll never take commissions. Now I take commissions again. So if you want pirate stuff, you want colonial stuff, hit me up. This is the disclaimer section of this. As English is my first language, a lot of this is going to be focused on English laws. So if we're talking about Great Britain, Ireland, talking about the Americas, it's going to mostly be English. That's not to say I won't branch into other nations. I actually have some criminal records from the Mughal Empire of all places. So it's going to get interesting, hopefully. Hopefully you like this. I do have to note I have to choose some of my words wisely. Even though we're demonetized, I don't want the channel to get completely shut down. That would be bad. I don't want to anger Lord Neil.
Brimley, I do declare, I believe that the crew of the Fancy are starting a live stream again.
Oh no, sir. The last time they did that, they brought the firelocks.
Well, I do say, Brimley, how about you go and find something to ban them for? Demonetize them! Demonetize them. Definitely demonetize them. But, sir, they aren't monetized. They haven't a penny to their names. Brimley, did you talk back to me? I said demonetize them at once. Oh, yes, sir, I will. Right away, sir, right away. Do you want me to shadow ban them as well? Why, yes, Brimley. I believe it is time. Unleash the shadow ban. Shadow ban! Why, yes, I do think I'll take care of this here crew of the Fancy. Make sure nobody ever sees that wretched channel again.
Even though the bad guys don't typically use the words that we use to describe them, for some reason, most of the algorithms, if you say such things as PDF file and people who cause scary things, yeah, you get demonetized. I'm hoping this makes some sense. And yeah, this is going to get dark periodically. I mean, this is an introduction, so I'm going to try to be a little light on it. Just give you some basics in English common law, some of the modern implications of it. And I'm going to cover about 2 cases in this one. The last case I'm going to cover today, you might feel a little bit better with this one. Don't worry, it gets worse. So let's start with the concept of a plea. This will feature prominently in many of these stories. In the United States, we are lucky to have the Fifth Amendment. We don't have to plea. We don't have to speak against ourselves. We don't even have to talk. Now, does this work all the time in practice? And the answer is no. The conditions in many county jails and prisons makes valid the idea that the system of forced pleas still exists even here in the United States. Although we claim to have a system of timely trials, in many places, those in jail and prison will wait longer for a court date than those on the outside. This is by design, especially in places with for-profit prisons. The risk of corruption remains as active as it ever did in the past. And I need to note here, if, let's say, you decide you're going to go to court, you're going to fight it, you don't get money for winning unless you file a lawsuit, and the chances of those going through are very low. So you could have lost your job, your career, everything in that time period. You don't get anything back for it. That's why there's a lot of people that will take a plea even if they didn't do it. In the early modern period, the concept of remaining silent did not exist, and pleas were often forced. This is where this series gets its name. A plea of guilty or a guilty verdict would not just condemn the accused, but if they were convicted and executed, would forfeit their families from inheriting whatever land and wealth they had in their name. Many would die silent in the press yard just to keep their families provided for. The press yard takes its name from the concept of literally placing weight upon a prisoner to force a plea. It wasn't a punishment. It was literally to get the case to move forward to a trial. In American history, we have the famous case of Giles Corey. He and his wife Martha were accused of witchcraft in 1692 in Salem, Massachusetts. In a later video, I will likely cover the corruption and reasons behind the Salem witch trials. But for this moment, I will focus specifically on the death of Giles Corey. There was nothing he could do about the questionable evidence against him, and knowing the trials were shams, he was silent. The courts ordered him to face what was called peine forte et dire. Apologies, I am still working on my French. Under the supervision of Sheriff George Corwin, he was laid on his back. He was restrained with a piece of wood placed across his chest and stomach, and stones were placed on top of it. He would be fed just enough to keep him somewhat alive. At times, the sheriff himself would stand on the stones. At one point, Giles Corey's tongue was forced from his mouth, and the sheriff, with a stick, forced it back in. This man refused to cave. Various accounts say that with his weakened voice, he asked for more and more weight and damned and cursed Salem. Samuel Sewall, a judge at Salem, who would later write an apology, and in 1700 would also write a criticism of slavery. Listen, big thing on this. Most people in this era are shades of gray. There's no good or bad guys. Everybody is either good or sucks to a certain degree. So keep this in mind. Samuel Sewall would write in his diary that about noon at Salem, Giles Corey was pressed to death for standing mute. Much pains was used with him 2 days, one after another. Very few would be able to withstand the press yard, and most were forced to plea. The practice would not be abolished until 1772. In 1827, a plea of silence would mean an automatic plea of not guilty. Don't worry, dear viewer. If the pre-trial didn't kill you, in 1689 there were 50 capital offenses in England and Wales, and by the end of the 18th century there were upwards of 220, at peak of over 350. Reforms between 1823 and 1861 dropped that number down to a reasonable 5. Whig politicians, in an effort to protect the wealth of the growing merchant class, was the prime mover of what was called the Bloody Code, which included the Black Act of 1723, the specific one responsible for the number rising to 350. I should add, this is different than the Black Act of 1774, which banned exterior decorations on new homes, as they were considered sometimes to be fire hazards. Yeah, some of that boring Georgian architecture is actually the result of a law. You may be wondering, what were some of the laws which could land you on the gallows? I'm not about to sit here and list all of them, but here are a few covering the general topics. Some of these were broken into several laws, some of these were standalone. Let's start with grand larceny. Theft was considered capital if it involved a horse or anything more than 12 shillings. Converting the 1690 to present, this equals roughly to 72 pounds, or in freedom money, $94.50. As we'll see in some of these stories, the value of goods was a bit different then than it is today. So using conversions, it's not entirely accurate, but it gives you a rough idea. Jurors, recognizing how absurd this was, would at times undervalue the goods that were stolen. So you're going to see things where somebody might say, "Oh, it was a pound," and it was like, "Oh no, that's only 5 pence." Continuing, high treason. But keep in mind, there was no separation of church and state. So if you were Catholic, depending on time period, there was a chance you could end up condemned for even innocent things. And forget about being a nonconformist of any sort. You weren't safe either. Keep in mind, William Penn was in prison for being a Quaker before he was released and founded Pennsylvania. Luckily, his father was a war hero who the king owed a debt. Offenses against public order. Basically, don't protest, don't riot, But this could also be destroying infrastructure such as levees or bridges, which, it's understandable. Doing that could actually hurt people. So I guess kind of works. Trying to stop the administration of justice. So if you wanted to rescue your Catholic friend who stole a pair of 12-shilling shoes, that would end with you beside them. If you did something against public health, keep in mind, the plague and smallpox were still very real threats in this era, and they were starting to understand what was causing it. That could be breaking quarantine or trying to stop doctors from doing their jobs. Yes, you could end up on the gallows for that. Smuggling or not paying your taxes could potentially land you on the gallows. There was always the workhouse if the state wanted to make a profit. Petty treason or murder. Now, you might be asking yourself, what is petty treason? Get ready to get mad at the past. In many cases I've read, it is when a wife decides to unalive her husband. Why? Because petty treason is the deletion of somebody considered to be above you in rank. So to commit murder is to unalive anyone equal to or lesser in power to you. But petty treason is against authority. Yeah, the past sucks, but don't worry. Cases of abuse were sometimes considered and pled down to lesser charges. Sometimes. Maiming a person without cause. Cases of accident and self-defense were considered. Stealing from your boss. So, yeah, you wouldn't be able to take pens home from work with you. If you were bankrupt and committed any crime, so you're bankrupt, you need food, guess what? You're going to jail and possibly the gallows. Forgery of government documents or currency. So, now this is an indentured document. This one is a government one. Yeah, having one of these, this is a fake. It's a reproduction. I'm going to jail. And speaking of which, clipping coins was a capital offense. Coins at this time were based on weight. A common crime was to cut pieces off the coins to be melted down into goods or to be used themselves as coinage. This isn't the same as cutting the coins. A lot of times you'll see coins getting cut. This is where you take a little bit off the side and oh yeah, this is a shilling. Here you go. When in fact the weight is not correct because you cut that little bit off. Now, it doesn't seem like a lot, but if you're somebody that's working in a trade where you're getting a lot of coinage, clipping that little bit off, you're making more money off that one coin. That is a crime. Also note, a lot of the cut coins that we see are foreign coins that were used based entirely upon weight. What they're talking about are a lot of the English coins that are face value. Impersonating somebody to defraud. For those of us flooded with daily spam messages or replies on social media, we might consider bringing this one back. I'm kidding, right? Committing major property damage such as arson. Repeat criminals. If you made a habit of ending up in court on a regular basis for small offenses, you could end up on the gallows. Case in point, when I talked about Rachel Wall in that earlier video, she was a repeat offender. She ended up on the gallows largely for that, not because she was a pirate, which I hope you've seen from that video is not true. She was not a pirate. Now this one gets dark. A child between the ages of 7 and 14 who showed evidence of being malicious. For instance, a repeat shoplifter. Yep, children could in fact end up on the gallows. Destroying a ship to commit insurance fraud. Just remember, insurance fraud is bad, even in the past. It's the crime you pay for. Piracy. That goes without saying much. Homosexuality. Variations of this law sans the death penalty continued in England well into the modern era and saw such names as Oscar Wilde and Alan Turing as victims. Don't worry though, if you were rich and overall politically protected, you'd avoid some punishment. Something you're going to keep in mind in these. There's some things that never change. If you notice, there's something that I have not listed, and I have to use friendly words for it. SA. Well, it's not. That was on the list too, but it needs to get into the topic of statutory SA. Which leads to another point. What was the age of consent? One of the first things I sometimes will do is look at Wikipedia to see, like, can you just give me a quick answer? I just need a quick answer. Let's see what it is. I couldn't find it. So it came down to me reading through court documents, some of them getting very, very dark. In practice, the normal age of marriage in the early 18th century in the American colonies seems to have been right around 18 to early 20s. So not awful. But legal marriage could happen much younger, especially when it came to the geopolitical needs of the aristocracy. Marrying off your 4-year-old to a 6-year-old to establish an alliance was not out of the question. But that is not what we're talking about. The age of consent through much of the world in this time period seems to have been 12, which is definitely awful, but it gets worse. In the late 17th century in England, I've been encountering quite a few cases that were thrown out because the victim was 10, and that was considered the age of consent. This is late 17th century into about the mid 18th century. I have not gone much further. I do not know when it was changed. I'm a dad. I was also an inmate at one point, and let me tell you, even though there is upwards of 400 years separating me from these events, I allegedly want someone at one point in time to have walked into the cell and made some of these folks fall off their bunk. When you read about the people and events of the time period, kids have always been kids. Yeah, they might have been exposed to awful things at very young ages, like losing most of their siblings to the plague, but they were still very much kids. And it becomes clear that there were predators even back then. I will turn back to what I said at the beginning of this section. The norm for relationships and marriage seems to have been within what we consider to be young adulthood. And if you read statements by some judges and witnesses, it seems the overall population were on the same page about what we call today PDF files. Thank you, YouTube. I also like the Australian one, which I think I can say rock spiders. Now for the good news. Even with all those things that were capital offenses, the courts would look at extenuating circumstances and would sometimes put other options on the table. For instance, transportation. Instead of the gallows, you could request sometimes, or be forced to, take a very unwanted vacation to some place on the other side of the world in lands that your body may not be acclimated to, in a ship where conditions might be worse than the prisons of the time. Usually, this would include indentured servitude, or potentially hard labor for the government. Even though many of these places, such as Jamaica comes up quite a bit, Virginia, Australia, if you were French, New Orleans, often seem like tourist destinations today, disease and climate were often a death sentence. Yes, even in Virginia, which is considered to have a fairly moderate climate, like some of the records I was looking at with Virginia and Maryland when it came to death from local disease, it got pretty nasty. Only 25% of those found guilty of capital offenses would actually face execution. Of those, 75% were thieves. Oh, and if you did get a lesser charge, you could look forward to fines, floggings, the stocks, pillory. In wartime, potentially military service, although the military tried not to have criminals. If it got real bad, yeah, they might bring you in. Branding was also an option. There was very little reference to prison terms outside of psychiatric hospitals like Bedlam, which they did have mental institutions at the time. How effective were they depended on who the who the head doctor was at the time. There's a lot of stories I'll probably get into. Oh, there's also workhouses. Don't worry, with a workhouse, you would learn a great repetitive trade and pay off your debt to society, or potentially perish due to living conditions, malnourishment, disease, or potentially abuse by your boss. Let's say you didn't get the lesser charge and your date was set. there was still a chance of the crown taking pity on you. Perhaps you were somebody important, or perhaps your case drew the right kind of attention, or perhaps there was a political gain to be made. You could be pardoned, or even still given a lesser punishment. If you were a woman, you could potentially plead your belly, as in get pregnant. In some cases, that would only grant you temporary reprieve. In others, you'd be given a lesser punishment, if not just fully released. Well, let's just say you didn't get lucky. For most offenses, it was the gallows. This was not the later scientific method of hanging. Most weren't so lucky and would dance what was called the Tyburn jig as they slowly lost oxygen to their brain. If you had friends and depending on local rules, they might have pulled you down a little bit to make the event much faster. Keep in mind your executioner might have gotten the job as an alternative to your fate. See, that was an option. You could be like, "Well, don't don't send me there. Let me work there." That's a possibility. They'd often receive your clothes and personal effects as part of their pay. You could also potentially bribe them to do a better job. If there's no end to it, like, hey, I'll tell you where I hid the money. You can have it. And there were times that if the execution failed, you might be able to get a reprieve, but that was not always guaranteed. If you were charged with treason or some of the coinage offenses, then if you were a poor man, you could be punished by drawing, hanging, and quartering. Drawn behind the wagon, hanged, sometimes this was not until lights out. Keep in mind, this sometimes was not until lights out. Sometimes you were very awake. And then quartering, which there's plenty of YouTube videos that explain that. If a woman, then burning. Sometimes you were given lights out beforehand, and other times it didn't work out. Keep in mind that in English law, this was not typically a thing for witchcraft, though in some areas we do think of as British, burnings did happen. In Salem, it was hanging. Burning was also used in a colony against those of any gender who tried to start slave uprisings. I'm very likely going to be doing a few videos on that as, I mean, it's very relevant to this channel. Now, if you were a member of nobility, man or woman, you would face beheading. In those instances, you'd really want a competent and mostly sober executioner, which sometimes did not happen. There are plenty of grisly and tragic accounts of multiple swings being required against a conscious victim. There's just such a tale after the Monmouth Rebellion, if you ever want me to do a video on that. Now, afterwards, if your crime was exceptionally vile in the eyes of the state, you could be put in a gibbet or potentially have your body parts displayed. Even Oliver Cromwell didn't escape that fate after a natural death. He was dug up, beheaded, and his head was mounted on a pike and was then stolen. But that's a story for another day. Somehow worse, depending on your perspective, at various points in time, your friends and family may have to hurry away with your body or have the funds available as a bribe to prevent your mortal remains from ending up in the basement of a surgeon or medical school. Sounds wonderful, doesn't it? With this background, I may as well get into one of the dockets that I read, just so you can see how the courts operated. In this case, I'm going to use one of my favorite sources, the Proceedings of the Old Bailey. For those on your phones, they do have an app available. And I 100% downloaded it, and it's amazing. And best of all, it's for free. I think they do accept donations, though. So if you want to donate to keep them going, please do. The Old Bailey was the main courthouse of London throughout this time period. It saw not just civilian courts, but admiralty courts as well, famously for Kidd and other pirates. At this time, on the 26th of May, 1680, it was still open air. This was largely for health reasons, as fear of another plague were still very strong. The last had run its course in 1666, only 14 years before. Because it was open air, it wasn't uncommon for there to be an audience outside of the courtroom. There would have been street noise, the jeers of the crowd, ballad mongers selling songs about rather infamous cases, and God help those who tried to bring punishment upon somebody the crowds actually liked. There's plenty of accounts of jurors being too scared to pass judgment on somebody because they were afraid what the crowds would do to them. Today we have the trial of a waterman, accused of murdering a constable at the Armitage Stairs. I've not found the exact location of these stairs, by the way, but they were likely one of the many which led from the streets down to the shores and piers along the Thames. Also of note, constables at this time were often selected from the homeowners of a ward, and it was a temporary position. Other times they'd be appointed or even later on, and often in the United States at present, would be elected. They were in charge of the watch and would carry out tasks for the courts to include making arrests, finding witnesses, chasing fugitives, collecting fines, and most of what's typically done today by the police and sometimes other agencies, such as sheriffs. Around 9 o'clock at night, some days before, a half dozen or more Scottish sailors belonging to a ship in the river were returning, having "'tis probable taking plentiful cups as sailors use." They were drunk. To get to their boat, they had to walk through others. Given the lack of a floating pier, this would not have been unusual. At some point, they either stepped on or offended a boy on the ship of the prisoner, and that caused a fight to ensue. The boy, an Englishman, ran to his master in this case being the ship's master, the man responsible for keeping the ship in good order for a captain or company. This is the waterman that we're talking about. Sometimes he'd even be the actual owner. In this case, I think he was the actual owner just based on some of the things that were said. The fight became worse with others joining in. The master was a local and knew the local constable. According to the trial documents, they were actually close friends. The documents also make note that he'd sometimes use his friend's house since it was so close to store some of the tackle for the boat. The ropes, the rigging, all that. If he had extra, he'd stash at his friend's house. The constable returned with the master, and in the darkness, the constable ended up murdered. The trial documents say specifically that his brains were beat out. The Scotsman, realizing a murder had been committed, ran away. The prisoner was the only one left, other than the boy. As he was likewise armed, it was assumed that he was the one who committed the murder. The shouting and fighting would have undoubtedly attracted the attention of the watchman, and of course, finding the master armed and the constable dead and nobody else around, the decision was made to bring him in. In this case, he had just witnessed the murder of his friend and was now being accused of it. There is no reference to pressing or anything else, so he very likely pleaded not guilty. Said the court did do their job and found multiple witnesses. They were all questioned, and we can imagine his neighbors and friends, those not brought in, would have been outside shouting in his defense. When time came for the verdict, there would have been silence. Everyone was waiting to hear. Parents would be hushing their children. This is the entertainment equivalent of a good episode of Law and Order at its peak. CSI before the spinoffs. Although there was some talk that he may have struck the constable on accident, in which case he would have been found guilty of manslaughter, the court recognized that there had been no malice between he and the constable, and throughout the whole proceeding, it stressed that they were best friends. His neighbors said he was honest, civil, and quiet. The last part appears a lot with modern serial killers, but in this case, it was apparently true in the eyes of the court because the verdict was decided and he was acquitted. Sadly, no names were given, so it's tough to tell if he managed to avoid the law afterward. There's also no reference to any future apprehension of a gang of Scottish sailors either. In future videos, the verdict may not always be as pleasant, and many times cases were not quite as straightforward. I figure with all discussion of executions, it was a good note to end on, although not for the poor constable. If you enjoyed this video, please like, share, comment, subscribe. Definitely subscribe. If you wish to help the channel, hey, feel free to donate, join our Patreon, buy something. Have an awesome day. Oh yeah, don't go to jail, okay? Seriously, avoid going to jail.